Margaret Thompson stood in the middle of the narrow cobblestone street, her designer handbag clutched tightly in her manicured hands. The autumn morning was crisp in the historic district of Windsor, and she had been walking her small, perfectly groomed poodle when the commotion began. She heard the distant sound of marching feet and military commands echoing through the ancient stone buildings. Margaret was not just any ordinary woman. She was the wife of a successful banker, lived in a mansion overlooking the Thames, and believed that her social status entitled her to special treatment wherever she went. At 52 years old, she had spent decades cultivating an image of importance and superiority. Her perfectly styled blonde hair, expensive clothing, and condescending attitude made her a well-known figure in the affluent circles of Windsor. The sound of approaching footsteps grew louder, accompanied by the rhythmic clinking of metal and leather. Margaret glanced around and noticed that other pedestrians were quickly moving to the sides of the street, pressing themselves against shop windows and doorways. Some pulled out their phones to record whatever was coming, while others simply watched with respectful anticipation. But Margaret refused to move. She planted her feet firmly on the cobblestones and lifted her chin defiantly. In her mind, she was far too important to be inconvenienced by whatever military parade or ceremony was taking place. After all, she paid substantial taxes, her husband was well connected in political circles, and she considered herself practically royalty in her own right. The marching grew closer, and Margaret could now see the first glimpse of red uniforms and tall black hats approaching around the corner. The sight should have been her first clue that this was no ordinary military exercise. These were the famous guards of the British royal family, their pristine uniforms gleaming in the morning sunlight, their movements precise and ceremonial. A young police officer stationed at the corner noticed Margaret standing stubbornly in the middle of the street. He approached her politely, touching the brim of his cap in a respectful gesture that Margaret interpreted as recognition of her importance. "Excuse me, madam," the officer said in a gentle but firm voice. "I'm going to need you to step aside, please. We have a royal procession coming through and the street needs to be cleared for security reasons." Margaret's eyes flashed with indignation. The word royal meant nothing to her in that moment. All she heard was someone telling her what to do, and she had never responded well to commands from people she considered beneath her station. "I beg your pardon?" "Young man," she replied in her most imperious tone, her voice carrying the entitled edge that had intimidated shop clerks and service workers for decades. "I am Margaret Thompson, and I have every right to walk on this public street. I pay my taxes, my husband is a prominent member of this community, and I will not be ordered around by some uniformed boy who probably earns less in a year than I spend on shoes." The police officer's expression remained professional, though Margaret caught a slight tightening around his eyes. He had clearly dealt with difficult people before, but something about his demeanor suggested that this situation was more serious than Margaret realized. "Mrs. Thompson, I understand your position, but this is a matter of royal protocol and security. I really must insist that you move to the sidewalk immediately. The procession will be here in just a few moments, and there are serious legal consequences for interfering with royal duties." Margaret laughed, a sharp, dismissive sound that echoed off the stone walls surrounding them. She had spent her entire adult life getting her way through sheer force of personality and social pressure. The idea that some young police officer could intimidate her was absurd. "Legal consequences?" she scoffed, adjusting her grip on her poodle's jeweled leash. "Do you have any idea who you're speaking to? One phone call from my husband and you'll be directing traffic in some remote village instead of playing dress-up here in Windsor. I suggest you focus on whatever little parade is coming instead of harassing law-abiding citizens." The sound of marching was now very close, and Margaret could hear the ceremonial music accompanying the procession. The officer's radio crackled with urgent communications, and she noticed that his colleagues were gesturing frantically from their positions along the route. Around them, the crowd of onlookers had grown silent, many of them filming the confrontation with barely concealed shock and amusement. They could see what Margaret apparently could not, that she was about to make the mistake of a lifetime. The young officer made one final attempt to reason with her, his voice now carrying a note of genuine concern rather than mere professional courtesy. "Mrs. Thompson, please, for your own sake, step aside now. What's coming around that corner is not just any royal procession. This is something very special, very important, and very serious. You really don't want to be standing in the middle of the street when they arrive." But Margaret had already made up her mind. She crossed her arms over her chest, her expensive jewelry catching the morning light, and planted herself even more firmly in the center of the cobblestone street. Her poodle seemed nervous, tugging at its leash and whimpering softly, but Margaret ignored the animal's distress. "I am not moving 1 inch," she declared loudly enough for the gathering crowd to hear. "If whoever is coming has a problem with me standing on a public street, they can go around me. I refuse to be intimidated by some overblown ceremony for whatever minor royal has decided to inconvenience the tax-paying public today." The officer stepped back, speaking rapidly into his radio while keeping his eyes on Margaret. The marching sounds were now so close that individual footsteps could be distinguished, along with the ceremonial commands being shouted by military officers. Margaret smiled triumphantly, convinced that she had won this battle of wills. She had no idea that her victory was about to turn into the most humiliating experience of her privileged life, and that the person she was about to obstruct was someone whose authority extended far beyond anything her husband's banking connections could ever challenge. The first row of guards appeared around the corner with military precision that took Margaret's breath away, despite her determination to remain unimpressed. These were not ordinary soldiers playing dress-up for tourists. These were the elite guards of the royal household, their scarlet tunics immaculate, their black bearskin hats standing tall and proud, their rifles held at perfect angles as they marched in formation. The officer in charge, a stern-faced man with decades of military service etched into his weathered features, spotted Margaret immediately. His sharp eyes assessed the situation in seconds, taking in her defiant posture, expensive clothing, and the small crowd of onlookers who were now openly filming the confrontation with their smartphones. Without breaking stride, the officer barked a command that made Margaret jump despite herself. "Company, halt!" The entire formation stopped with a synchronized crash of boots on cobblestone that echoed through the narrow street like thunder. Margaret felt a moment of uncertainty as dozens of highly trained soldiers fixed their gaze upon her. Their faces were stern and professional, showing no emotion, but their very presence radiated an authority that she had never encountered before. For the first time since this confrontation began, she felt a small flutter of doubt in her stomach. The commanding officer stepped forward, his polished boots clicking against the stones with each measured step. His uniform was decorated with ribbons and insignia that spoke of years of dedicated service to the crown. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of absolute authority. "Madam, you are obstructing a royal procession. I am ordering you to remove yourself from this street immediately." Margaret's moment of doubt vanished as quickly as it had appeared. She had spent too many years believing in her own importance to back down now, especially with so many people watching and recording. In her mind, this was just another case of someone trying to push her around, and she had never allowed that to happen before. "And I am telling you that I have every right to be here," she replied, her voice rising to match what she perceived as his aggressive tone. "This is a public street paid for by taxpayers like me. I don't care what kind of costume party you're having, you cannot order private citizens around." A murmur rippled through the crowd of onlookers. Some were recording everything on their phones, while others exchanged glances of disbelief and anticipation. Several tourists who had been hoping to glimpse the royal procession now found themselves witnessing something far more dramatic and potentially scandalous. The commanding officer's expression remained impassive, but Margaret noticed that he glanced back toward the rest of the procession, which was still hidden around the corner. He seemed to be receiving some kind of signal or instruction through a small earpiece that she hadn't noticed before. "Madam, I am giving you one final opportunity to comply voluntarily. Move to the sidewalk immediately, or you will be physically removed and face charges for obstructing royal duties, disturbing the peace, and potentially threatening national security." Margaret let out another sharp laugh, though this one sounded slightly less confident than before. The mention of national security seemed ridiculous to her, and she assumed it was just an empty threat designed to intimidate her into submission. "National security?" she mocked, adjusting her designer scarf with an exaggerated flourish. "What exactly am I threatening, your little parade? Are you afraid I might throw confetti at someone important? This is absolutely ridiculous, and when my husband hears about this treatment, there will be serious consequences for all of you." The officer spoke briefly into a small microphone attached to his collar, then nodded as if receiving confirmation of something important. Margaret couldn't hear what was being said, but she noticed that several of the guards were now positioning themselves strategically around her. cutting off her potential escape routes without making it obvious to the casual observer. Behind the guards, Margaret could hear new sounds approaching. There were horses now, their hooves creating a distinctive rhythm on the cobblestones, accompanied by the rolling of wheels and the gentle creaking of what sounded like a very substantial carriage. The ceremonial music was growing louder as well, performed by what was clearly a full military band. "Ma'am," the police officer who had originally approached her said, stepping back into the conversation with obvious concern in his voice. "Please reconsider. What's coming is not just any royal event. This is—" He paused, glancing at the commanding officer as if seeking permission to reveal something important. The officer nodded grimly. "This is Her Majesty's personal guard escort for a state occasion. The carriage approaching contains members of the immediate royal family traveling to Westminster for a ceremony of the highest importance to the realm." For the first time, Margaret felt a genuine chill of apprehension. The words immediate royal family carried implications that even her self-absorbed mind couldn't completely ignore. But she had gone too far now to back down gracefully, and her pride would not allow her to admit that she might have made a mistake. "I don't care if it's the Queen herself," Margaret declared, though her voice carried a slight tremor that hadn't been there before. "I am a British citizen with rights, and I will not be bullied by anyone, regardless of their title or position." The crowd gasped audibly at her words. Several people lowered their phones, suddenly realizing that they might be recording something that could have serious legal consequences for the woman at the center of the drama. Others continued filming, recognizing that they were witnessing a moment that would likely become viral on social media within hours. The sound of approaching horses grew louder, accompanied by new voices shouting ceremonial commands. Margaret could see additional guards appearing around the corner. These ones mounted on magnificent black horses and carrying ceremonial lances with colorful pennants, flying in the morning breeze. The commanding officer checked his watch and spoke again into his collar microphone. Whatever response he received seemed to settle the matter for him. He turned back to Margaret with an expression that was both professional and somehow apologetic. "Very well, madam. You have been given multiple opportunities to comply voluntarily. What happens next is entirely your own choice." Margaret opened her mouth to deliver another defiant response, but before she could speak, the sound of the approaching procession reached a crescendo. The mounted guards rounded the corner in perfect formation, followed by the most magnificent royal carriage she had ever seen, its gold leaf gleaming in the sunlight, its windows dark but clearly occupied by figures whose identity would soon shock Margaret to her very core. The royal carriage that appeared around the corner was beyond anything Margaret had ever imagined. It wasn't just a vehicle, it was a masterpiece of craftsmanship that belonged in a museum. The gilded frame caught the morning sunlight and seemed to glow with an inner fire. The wheels were enormous and perfectly polished, and the entire carriage moved with a grace that defied its obvious weight and grandeur. 8 perfectly matched black horses pulled the carriage, their coats gleaming like silk, their movements synchronized as if they were dancing rather than simply walking. The mounted guards surrounding the carriage sat their horses with the kind of precision that only came from years of ceremonial training. Their lances held at identical angles, their uniforms without a single wrinkle or smudge. Margaret's mouth fell open despite her determination to remain unimpressed. Even in her world of luxury and privilege, she had never seen anything quite like this display of royal pageantry. The carriage was clearly built for the most important occasions of state, the kind of events that were broadcast around the world and remembered for generations. But it was the flags flying from the carriage that made Margaret's blood run cold. These weren't just any royal standards. These were the personal flags reserved for the most senior members of the royal family, the symbols that indicated the presence of individuals whose authority was absolute and whose dignity was protected by centuries of law and tradition. The carriage slowed as it approached the obstruction in the street, and Margaret could see movement behind the darkened windows. Figures were leaning forward, clearly trying to understand why their procession had been halted. She caught glimpses of elegant clothing and what appeared to be formal military uniforms with decorations that gleamed even in the filtered light inside the carriage. The commanding officer approached the carriage and spoke in low, urgent tones to someone Margaret couldn't see. She watched his body language change from professional confidence to something approaching concern as he explained the situation. After a few moments, he stepped back and returned to where Margaret stood frozen in the middle of the street. "Madam, I have just informed their Royal Highnesses of the situation. You have created a diplomatic incident by refusing to clear the street for a state procession. This is no longer a simple matter of traffic control. You are now directly defying the royal family in the execution of their constitutional duties." Margaret's knees felt weak, but her pride wouldn't let her collapse. She had built her entire identity around being someone who couldn't be pushed around, someone whose social status protected her from consequences. The idea that she might have miscalculated so dramatically was almost too frightening to contemplate. I didn't know it was," she stammered, then caught herself and forced her voice back to its previous defiant tone. "That doesn't change anything. I still have rights as a British citizen. They can wait 5 minutes for me to finish my walk." A collective gasp arose from the crowd of onlookers. Several people actually stepped further back, as if Margaret's words might somehow contaminate them by association. Others continued filming, realizing that they were documenting what might become one of the most infamous acts of disrespect toward the royal family in modern British history. The carriage door opened with a soft click that somehow carried clearly through the morning air. Margaret watched in growing horror as a figure began to emerge from within. First came a polished military boot, then a leg in perfectly pressed formal trousers with a red stripe down the side. The figure that stepped out was tall, imposing, and unmistakably royal. It was Prince William, the heir to the throne, in full ceremonial military dress. His uniform was covered with medals and decorations that represented his service to the crown and his position in the line of succession. His bearing was everything that Margaret's pretensions were not: genuine authority based on birth, training, and a lifetime of public service. The prince surveyed the scene with the calm composure that came from years of dealing with unexpected situations in the public eye. His gaze took in the guards, the crowd of onlookers, the police officers, and finally settled on Margaret herself. When their eyes met, she felt as if she were being examined by someone who had been trained from birth to assess people in situations with absolute clarity. Behind Prince William, Margaret could see another figure moving within the carriage. The silhouette was unmistakably feminine, elegant, and carried itself with the kind of grace that suggested royal breeding. Catherine, the Princess of Wales, was also present, though she remained seated, watching the proceedings through the carriage window with an expression of polite concern. Prince William approached slowly, his hands clasped behind his back in a posture that was both relaxed and commanding. Every step he took seemed to emphasize the enormous gulf between his genuine authority and Margaret's pretended importance. When he spoke, his voice was cultured, calm, and carried the weight of someone who had never needed to raise his voice to command respect. "Good morning," he said, addressing not just Margaret but the entire scene. "I understand there seems to be some confusion about the nature of this procession." Margaret's mouth opened and closed several times before she managed to find her voice. The words she had been so ready to speak moments before now seemed to die in her throat as she faced the reality of who she had been obstructing. This wasn't some minor royal doing a publicity appearance. This was the future King of England, and she had just told his guards that she didn't care if it was the Queen herself. Your Royal Highness," she finally managed to stammer, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't realize." Prince William raised one eyebrow slightly, a gesture that somehow conveyed both amusement and genuine curiosity about how this situation had developed. He glanced at the commanding officer, who stepped forward to provide a brief professional summary of the confrontation. "I see," the prince said when the officer finished his report. "So you were informed multiple times that this was a royal procession, but you chose to remain in the street anyway because you believed your rights as a taxpayer superseded our constitutional duties." Margaret felt the blood drain from her face as she heard her own arguments repeated back to her in the prince's calm, reasonable tone. What had sounded like righteous indignation when she spoke, the words now sounded like the petulant complaints of someone who had dramatically overestimated her own importance. The crowd of onlookers had grown substantially, and Margaret was suddenly acutely aware that dozens of people were recording every moment of her humiliation. The story would be on social media within minutes and newspapers by evening, and would likely follow her for the rest of her life. But the worst part was yet to come, because Prince William wasn't finished speaking. and the expression on his face suggested that he had something very specific in mind for how this unprecedented situation should be resolved. Prince William studied Margaret for a long moment, his expression thoughtful rather than angry. When he finally spoke again, his voice carried the tone of someone who was genuinely trying to understand rather than simply pronounce judgment. "Mrs. Thompson, isn't it?" he said, having apparently been briefed on her identity. "I'm curious about something. You mentioned that you pay taxes and therefore have rights that supersede royal protocol. Tell me, what exactly do you believe those taxes pay for?" Margaret's mind raced as she tried to formulate an answer that wouldn't make her sound even more foolish than she already did. The prince's question seemed simple enough, but something about the way he asked it suggested there was a deeper point he was trying to make. "Well, they pay for public services and roads and—" she began weakly. Her usual confidence completely evaporated in the face of his calm authority. "And the Crown Estate," Prince William continued helpfully, "and the maintenance of our constitutional monarchy. And ceremonies like this one, which we are conducting in service to the British people and the Commonwealth. In other words, your taxes help pay for exactly what you've been obstructing." A few nervous chuckles came from the crowd, though most people remained silent, sensing that they were witnessing something far more serious than a simple traffic dispute. Margaret felt her cheeks burning with embarrassment as the prince's logic made her previous arguments seem not just wrong, but absurdly self-defeating. Catherine, the Princess of Wales, chose that moment to step out of the carriage as well. Her appearance drew gasps of recognition from the crowd, and several people actually applauded spontaneously. She was dressed in an elegant coat and hat that suggested this was indeed a very formal state occasion, and her presence added another layer of significance to Margaret's unprecedented act of disrespect. The princess approached with the same calm dignity as her husband, but Margaret thought she detected a hint of curiosity in her expression, as if she were observing some fascinating social phenomenon that she had never encountered before. "Your Royal Highness," Margaret managed to say, attempting an awkward curtsy that looked more like she was losing her balance. This is all a terrible misunderstanding." Catherine smiled politely, the kind of expression that had been perfected through years of public appearances and diplomatic encounters. "I'm sure it is," she said warmly. "Perhaps you could help us understand what you were hoping to accomplish by blocking our procession." The question was asked with such genuine kindness that it somehow made Margaret feel even worse than Prince William's logical dismantling of her arguments. It forced her to confront the fact that she really had no good reason for her behavior beyond simple arrogance and a desire to assert her perceived importance. I thought," Margaret began, then stopped as she realized that any explanation she could offer would only make her sound more foolish. "I'm very sorry, Your Royal Highnesses. I made a terrible mistake." Prince William nodded thoughtfully as if considering how to respond to this unprecedented situation. "You did indeed make a mistake, Mrs. Thompson. But what concerns me more is that you made it so persistently, even after being given multiple opportunities to correct it. That suggests something deeper than simple confusion." He paused, glancing at the crowd of onlookers and the many phones that were recording every word. "You see, Mrs. Thompson, this ceremony we're attending today is a memorial service for fallen soldiers who died in service to the Crown and the British people. These guards you've been dismissing as a costume party are honoring their deceased comrades, and we are traveling to pay our respects to families who have lost sons and daughters in defense of the realm." Margaret felt as if the ground had opened up beneath her feet. A memorial service for fallen soldiers. She had obstructed a royal procession traveling to honor the war dead, and she had done it while mocking the very guards who were carrying out that solemn duty. I had no idea," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the ambient sounds of the street. "Of course you didn't," Catherine said gently, "because you didn't ask. You simply assumed that whatever you were doing was more important than whatever we were doing, without taking a moment to find out what that might be." The princess's words were spoken without malice, but they cut deeper than any angry rebuke could have. Margaret realized that she was being given a lesson in humility by two people who had been born to privilege far greater than anything she could imagine, yet who understood public service in a way that she never had. Prince William checked his watch with the practiced gesture of someone accustomed to a rigid schedule. "We are now significantly behind schedule, Mrs. Thompson. Military families are waiting for us at Westminster, and your actions have delayed our arrival for what may be the most important day of their lives. The weight of that statement settled over Margaret like a physical burden. She wasn't just dealing with the consequences of her own embarrassment anymore. Her stubborn behavior had affected real people who were grieving real losses. People who had planned their entire day around the royal family's presence at their memorial service. Is there anything I can do?" she asked desperately, though she already knew the answer. Prince William and Catherine exchanged a glance that seemed to communicate volumes without words. It was the kind of silent consultation that came from years of partnership in public service, where every decision had to be weighed against its impact on the crown, the public, and the people they served. "Actually," Prince William said slowly, "there is something you can do, but it would require you to set aside the same pride that got you into this situation in the first place." Margaret nodded eagerly, grasping at any opportunity to somehow redeem herself from this catastrophic mistake. She had no idea what the prince might ask of her, but at this point, she would have agreed to almost anything to escape the growing nightmare of her own making. The prince gestured toward the carriage, and Margaret noticed for the first time that there was additional seating that had been prepared for what appeared to be other passengers. Her heart began to race as she realized what he might be suggesting, but the full implications of his offer wouldn't become clear until he spoke again. "We are prepared to offer you the opportunity to accompany us to the memorial service, Mrs. Thompson, not as our guest, but as someone who needs to learn firsthand what true public service actually means." Margaret stared at Prince William in complete shock, unable to process what she had just heard. The idea that she might be invited to join the royal procession seemed impossible, especially after her behavior. Yet there was something in his expression that suggested this wasn't a joke or some form of elaborate punishment. "You want me to come with you?" she asked weakly, her voice cracking with disbelief. "I want you to understand what you delayed today," Catherine said, her tone still gentle but now carrying an unmistakable note of seriousness. "These memorial services aren't abstract ceremonies, Mrs. Thompson. They're deeply personal events for families who have lost everything in service to our country. Perhaps seeing that firsthand will help you understand why royal protocol exists in the first place." The commanding officer stepped forward, clearly having received instructions through his earpiece. "Your Royal Highnesses, we really must proceed. The service begins in 45 minutes, and with current traffic conditions..." Prince William nodded, then turned back to Margaret. "The choice is yours, Mrs. Thompson. You can remain here and deal with the legal consequences of obstructing a royal procession, or you can come with us and learn something that might change your perspective on what public service actually means. But if you choose to come, you'll do so under our conditions and with absolute respect for the solemnity of the occasion." Margaret's mind raced through her options. The legal consequences alone could be devastating. Obstructing a royal procession was a serious offense that could result in fines, jail time, and a criminal record that would follow her forever. But beyond that, the humiliation of being arrested in front of so many witnesses would destroy her carefully cultivated social standing completely. Yes, she said quickly, though she still didn't fully understand what she was agreeing to. "Yes, I'll come with you." Catherine extended a gracious hand to help Margaret into the carriage, a gesture that was both practical and symbolic. As Margaret climbed into the luxurious interior, she was struck by the contrast between her own frantic emotional state and the calm dignity of the royal couple. The interior of the carriage was even more magnificent than the exterior. The seats were upholstered in rich velvet, and every surface was decorated with intricate craftsmanship that spoke of centuries of royal tradition. Yet despite the grandeur, the atmosphere was one of solemn purpose rather than celebration. As the carriage began to move, Prince William explained what would be expected of her. "Mrs. Thompson, you will observe only. You will not speak unless spoken to. You will show absolute respect for the families we're meeting and the service members we're honoring. Is that understood?" "Yes, Your Royal Highness," Margaret replied, her voice barely above a whisper. She was beginning to understand that this wasn't an honor being bestowed upon her, but rather an education that she desperately needed. The procession continued through the streets of Windsor with renewed purpose, the guards marching with the precision that came from years of ceremonial training. Through the carriage windows, Margaret could see crowds of people lining the streets, many of them holding flags and signs expressing support for military families. Catherine pointed to a group of elderly veterans standing at attention as the procession passed. "Those men served in conflicts going back decades, Mrs. Thompson. Some of them lost friends whose names will be read today. For them, this isn't pageantry or tradition. It's remembrance of real sacrifice." Margaret watched the veterans with growing awareness of how badly she had misunderstood the significance of the day. These weren't people playing dress-up or putting on a show for tourists. They were participants in a living memorial to loss and sacrifice that stretched back generations. "May I ask?" she said hesitantly. "What exactly happened to the soldiers we're honoring today?" Prince William's expression grew even more serious. "They were killed in Afghanistan last month, Mrs. Thompson. Young men and women who volunteered to serve their country and never came home. Today's service is for their families, parents who will never see their children again, spouses who became widows and widowers in their 20s, children who will grow up without mothers and fathers." The weight of that information settled over Margaret like a physical blow. She had delayed a memorial service for recently killed soldiers because she was walking her poodle and didn't want to be inconvenienced. The magnitude of her selfishness was becoming clearer with every moment that passed. As they approached Westminster, Margaret could see crowds of people dressed in black, many of them clearly military families based on their bearing and the way they stood together in supportive groups. Some carried photographs, others held flowers, and all of them had the dignified sadness of people dealing with profound loss. "Those are the families," Catherine said softly, following Margaret's gaze. "They've been planning for this day since the funeral services ended. For many of them, this memorial represents the formal recognition of their loved one's sacrifice. They've been waiting for us to arrive so the ceremony can begin." Margaret felt tears starting to form in her eyes as the full implications of her actions became clear. These weren't abstract concepts anymore. They were real people, whose most important day she had thoughtlessly disrupted because of her own arrogance and sense of entitlement. The carriage began to slow as they approached the memorial site, and Margaret could see official photographers and media representatives preparing to document the ceremony. She realized with growing anxiety that her presence would likely be noticed and questioned. But before she could voice her concerns, Prince William addressed them directly. "Mrs. Thompson, you're about to see what true dignity looks like," he said, his voice carrying both instruction and warning. "Watch how these families conduct themselves despite their grief. Watch how they put service above personal comfort, duty above convenience. Perhaps you'll understand why we take royal protocol so seriously. It's not about our comfort. It's about honoring people like them." As the carriage came to a complete stop, Margaret braced herself for what she knew would be the most humbling experience of her privileged life. Through the window, she could see military honor guards preparing for the arrival of the royal party, and beyond them, dozens of families whose lives had been forever changed by loss and sacrifice. The door was about to open, and Margaret was about to step into a world where her money, her husband's connections, and her sense of social superiority meant absolutely nothing in the face of genuine human dignity and service. The moment Margaret stepped out of the royal carriage behind Prince William and Catherine, she was overwhelmed by the solemnity of the scene before her. Westminster's Memorial Garden was filled with military families dressed in their finest black clothing, many holding photographs of young men and women in uniform. The silence was profound, broken only by the gentle sound of wind through the memorial trees and the distant tolling of church bells. Margaret followed several steps behind the royal couple, acutely aware that she was completely out of place in this sacred gathering. Her expensive designer clothing, which had made her feel so important just hours before, now seemed gaudy and inappropriate among people whose elegant simplicity spoke of genuine grief and dignity. As they walked through the memorial garden, Catherine paused to speak with a young woman holding a baby who couldn't have been more than 6 months old. The woman's composure was remarkable despite the tears streaming down her face, and Margaret heard her explain that her husband had been killed just 3 weeks after their daughter was born. He never got to see her smile, the young widow said quietly to Catherine, who listened with complete attention and obvious compassion. But he was so proud to serve. He always said that protecting our way of life was worth any sacrifice. Margaret watched this exchange feeling completely humbled. Here was a woman who had lost everything but still spoke of her husband's sacrifice with pride rather than bitterness. The contrast with Margaret's own behavior earlier that morning was stark and painful. Prince William was speaking with an elderly couple who had lost their grandson in the same attack that killed the young father. The grandfather, a veteran himself, stood at attention despite his obvious grief, while his wife clutched a folded flag that had clearly been presented to them at their grandson's funeral. "He wanted to follow in my footsteps," the grandfather told Prince William, his voice steady despite the pain in his eyes. "Said he wanted to serve something bigger than himself. I'm proud of him, Your Highness, but I miss him terribly." Margaret felt her throat tighten as she listened to these conversations. Every family she observed showed the same remarkable combination of grief and pride, pain and dignity. They weren't asking for pity or special treatment. They were simply honoring their loved ones and supporting each other through an unimaginable loss. As the formal ceremony began, Margaret found herself positioned at the back of the gathering, able to observe but clearly separate from the families who belonged there. A military chaplain began reading the names of the fallen soldiers, and with each name, a photograph was placed on the memorial wall while their family members stepped forward to lay flowers. When the young widow's husband's name was called, she walked forward with her baby in her arms, her step steady and dignified despite her tears. As she placed white roses beneath his photograph, the baby began to cry, as if sensing her mother's emotion. The sound of the infant's distress in that solemn setting was heartbreaking, but the young woman simply held her daughter closer and whispered words of comfort. Margaret found herself crying for the first time in years, not from self-pity or frustration, but from genuine emotion for people she had never met but whose dignity and grace were teaching her things about character that she had never understood before. The ceremony continued. With military precision and heartfelt emotion, veterans who had served with the fallen soldiers spoke about their courage and dedication. Family members shared memories that revealed young people who had been devoted to service, to their families, and to ideals that transcended personal comfort or gain. During a moment of silence, Margaret became acutely aware of the sound of her own breathing and the beating of her heart. She thought about how she had spent her morning, walking her pampered poodle, focused entirely on her own convenience and comfort, angry at being asked to step aside for what she had dismissed as meaningless pageantry. Now she understood that every element of the royal protocol she had mocked served a purpose. The guard's precision honored military tradition and the sacrifice of people like those being remembered today. The ceremonial carriage represented the continuity of institutions that these soldiers had died defending. Even the crowds lining the streets were part of a national acknowledgement that some things were more important than individual convenience. When the formal ceremony concluded, families began to mingle, sharing stories and supporting each other in their grief. Margaret watched as Prince William and Catherine moved among them, not as distant royalty making obligatory appearances, but as genuine participants in a community of remembrance and respect. A middle-aged woman approached Margaret, noticing her tears and assuming she was another grieving family member. "Did you lose someone today too?" she asked gently. Margaret struggled to find her voice. "No," she finally managed. I was brought here to learn something, and I think I'm beginning to understand what that is." The woman nodded sympathetically. "These ceremonies change people," she said. "They remind us what really matters. My son would have been so proud to see how many people came to honor his memory and the memory of his fallen comrades." As the formal gathering began to wind down, Catherine approached Margaret with the same grace she had shown to every family member throughout the day. "Mrs. Thompson, what have you learned today?" Margaret took a deep breath, knowing that her answer would reveal whether she had truly understood the lesson she had been given. "I learned that I've been living a very small life, Your Royal Highness. I thought importance came from money and social position, but these families have shown me what real dignity looks like. They've lost everything that matters, but they're still focused on honoring something greater than themselves." Prince William joined the conversation, his expression thoughtful as he evaluated Margaret's response. "And what do you think you'll do with that knowledge, Mrs. Thompson?" Margaret knew that this was more than just a question about her personal growth. This was about whether she would return to her old patterns of entitlement and self-importance, or whether this experience would genuinely change how she lived her life and treated other people. "I think," she said slowly, "I need to find ways to serve something bigger than my own comfort and convenience. I need to learn what these families already know about putting duty and respect above personal desires." The response seemed to satisfy the royal couple. But Margaret knew that the real test wouldn't come in this moment of high emotion and newfound understanding. The real test would come when she returned to her normal life and had to choose whether to maintain this new perspective or slip back into her old habits of entitlement and selfishness. 6 months after the memorial service, Margaret Thompson's life had changed in ways she never could have imagined. The viral video of her confrontation with the royal guards had initially brought her exactly the kind of attention she had always craved, but not in the way she had expected. The footage of her arrogant defiance, followed by her obvious humiliation, had been viewed millions of times, making her a symbol of entitled behavior gone wrong. But something remarkable had happened in the aftermath. Instead of retreating into embarrassment and self-pity, Margaret had taken Prince William's challenge to heart. She had begun volunteering at a local veterans support center, initially as a way to make amends for her behavior, but gradually discovering a sense of purpose she had never experienced before. The work was nothing like her previous lifestyle of charity galas and social events. She spent her days helping elderly veterans navigate government bureaucracy, organizing support groups for military families, and learning about the real struggles faced by people who had served their country. It was demanding, often frustrating work that paid nothing and offered no social recognition, but it had given her life a meaning that all her wealth and status had never provided. Her husband had been skeptical at first, worried that his wife's newfound commitment to service was just another phase that would pass when something more interesting came along. But as months passed and Margaret's dedication only deepened, he began to see changes in her that went far beyond her schedule and activities. The Margaret who had once demanded special treatment from shop clerks and restaurant staff now treated everyone with the same respect she had learned from watching military families support each other through grief. The woman who had once measured her worth by her social connections now found satisfaction in helping a veteran's widow understand her benefits paperwork on a crisp morning exactly 6 months after her encounter with the royal procession. Margaret was walking through the same streets of Windsor where her transformation had begun. But this time, she was accompanied by 3 elderly veterans from her support group, helping them navigate to a medical appointment at the local military clinic. As they approached the familiar intersection where her confrontation with the guards had taken place, Margaret heard the distant sound of marching feet and ceremonial music. Her companion stopped and began moving toward the sidewalk with the automatic respect that came from decades of military training. "Sounds like another royal procession," one of the veterans observed. "We should clear the way." Margaret smiled, remembering how different her response had been the last time she heard those sounds. "Yes," she said, guiding her companions to a safe viewing position. "We absolutely should." The procession that appeared around the corner was smaller than the one she had obstructed months before, but it carried the same dignity and purpose. As the guards marched past, Margaret noticed several of them glancing in her direction, and she wondered if any of them remembered the incident that had changed her life so dramatically. Behind the guards came a familiar royal carriage, though this one carried different passengers for what was clearly a different occasion. As it passed, Margaret caught a glimpse of Catherine through the window, and for just a moment their eyes met. The princess smiled and nodded slightly, a gesture that seemed to acknowledge both recognition and approval. It was a small moment, lasting only seconds, but it felt like a completion of the circle that had begun with Margaret's moment of maximum arrogance and culminated in her current commitment to genuine service. After the procession passed, one of Margaret's veteran companions turned to her with curiosity. "You seemed quite moved by that, Margaret. Have you met the princess before?" Margaret considered how to answer the question. The full story of her encounter with the royal family had become part of her personal legend at the Veterans Center, though she always told it as an example of how privilege without purpose led to emptiness and shame. "She taught me something very important once," Margaret replied simply, "about the difference between demanding respect and earning it." As they continued toward the medical clinic, Margaret reflected on how completely her understanding of importance and dignity had changed. The work she did now would never make headlines or earn her social recognition. She would never again be the center of attention at charity galas or have her photograph in society magazines. But she had found something far more valuable than fame or status. She had discovered what it meant to serve something larger than herself, to find purpose in helping others rather than demanding service from them. The lesson that Prince William and Catherine had tried to teach her on that embarrassing morning had finally taken root and grown into a completely different way of living. That evening, Margaret sat in her study writing in the journal she had started keeping after the memorial service. The entry for that day was simple but profound. Saw the royal procession again today. This time I remembered to step aside. Not because I had to, but because I wanted to show respect for something bigger than my own convenience. Amazing how much difference perspective makes. As she closed the journal, Margaret realized that the woman who had stood defiantly in the middle of a cobblestone street 6 months earlier was gone forever. In her place was someone who understood that true importance came not from demanding recognition, but from serving others with quiet dignity. The royal guards had inadvertently given her the greatest gift of her life, the opportunity to discover who she really could be when she stopped pretending to be someone she wasn't. The viral video of her confrontation still occasionally surfaced on social media, usually accompanied by commentary about entitled behavior and comeuppance. But Margaret no longer cringed when she saw it. Instead, she viewed it as documentation of the day her real life began, the moment when her worst behavior led to her greatest transformation. In the end, Margaret Thompson had learned the most important lesson of all, that dignity could not be demanded or purchased, but had to be earned through service, humility, and genuine respect for others. And perhaps most remarkably, she had learned it from the very people she had initially tried to dismiss as irrelevant to her own importance.